Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Grape Lush Wash Processed Ethiopia from Dock Coffee Roasters. And there's the bag right there. And Dock, based out of Amsterdam, Netherlands, and they're a coffee roaster that has appeared on this channel a couple of times before. However, my familiarity with them extends far beyond that, as I've probably tried 30 different coffees of theirs since I first was introduced to them as a coffee roaster. And a lot of the reason for that is because there's a coffee shop nearby that does serve them pretty regularly as their drip offering, and their coffees interest me for a number of reasons, and I think that might have been on display during their most recent feature, which was in the Battle of the Tomato, where the coffee did finish last, and a lot of the reason for that was because it had so many of these super bright, savory aspects to the cup. And I felt like a review would really give me an opportunity to kind of discuss the impression I typically get when I am drinking a Dock coffee. So this will be a great example of that. Looking forward to discussing it, as this right here is day 35. And recipe we went with for this coffee was a 16:1 water to coffee ratio brewed at 210 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the Chemex, which indicates a more medium grind. Roast profile for Dock, this coffee specifically, sometimes they roast on the super light side of things, even lighter than a lot of the really light coffee roasters that a lot of people know. So I will call this an uber light for the roast profile because this one is really, really light. With all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 17, first impression, and the cup was pretty citric right from the onset. And this is going to be a theme in this coffee, as there was a really bright citric acidity in the cup. Very dominant from the first sip all the way until the end. It even cooled down into an even more bright citric acidity within the cup. Really strong on those lemon attributes. An okay first impression, as that's typically not my favorite direction for a coffee, especially in Ethiopian, but we continue on to day 19, as there was a little bit more depth to the cup, as the listed berry attributes were more present in the warmer temperatures. So they have a berry and a grape listed on here. I could see that at the warmer temperatures, but the cup really does ramp up on the citrus and the acidity as it does cool down. So that continued to remain the most dominant and pronounced characteristic. And I did something that I typically don't do with a lot of coffees. I decided to keep going with that. I decided to continue to push it in that direction, as I think a lot of people know I typically like to tone down maybe acidity, maybe fermentiness, maybe kind of funkiness to a cup. But I said, let's roll with it. Let's go with the acidity and continue to push it, as I increased the temperatures, and it definitely felt even more ramped up in that acidity. The benefit of that was I was able to get a little bit more depth to the cup as a whole, as there was a little bit of the savory aspect. They do have a black tea flavor note listed on here. Makes a lot of sense, slight bit of savoriness in this cup, and it was a little bit more lasting in the finish. Still heavily dominated by that citric acidity. Day 23, back through the Chemex at the higher temperatures, continuing to push that acidity, and it really does have a bright, long-lasting citric acidic finish to the cup. There is an underlying grape aspect. I've mentioned before that I typically don't pick up a ton of grape in most coffees. It's typically maybe a little bit more undefined of a berry sweetness or a berry component to the cup. It's there in the background though. I could definitely see it. Could be the priming effect, but it feels present in this cup. Definitely more secondary to the very strong citric acidity. Day 25, ran it through the April dripper, and that's something I've also been kind of experimenting with, is the April dripper. And what I really noticed from the April dripper was the citric acidity is present yet again, very much dominates the cup, but at this moment it was complemented by a more defined, more pronounced savory herbal tea-like component to the cup. So that's not much of an improvement for me, as I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of that savory aspect to coffee. Berry aspect is in the cup yet again, but it's a little bit more bright and tart as opposed to more sweet and clear. So not necessarily my favorite day. We continue on to day 27, as the coffee has been really consistent. One thing I've always found funny on their website is that they label their coffees as being consistent, because that's very accurate. I have a pretty good idea and impression of what I'm going to experience every time I have a Dock coffee, and that has been a theme since, well, I would say probably about a year ago, because their coffees have been pretty consistent from that point going forward. Grape aspect, more subtle, more in the background, slight savory tea, and a lot of these notes are a little repetitive, but that's again because this coffee, even with adjustments, remained really consistent. All it did was really ramp it up in certain directions, maybe get a little bit more depth to the cup, but you were still experiencing, in a nutshell, citric acidity. Day 29, a slight bit more coarse, and it did open up a little bit more as I was able to get a little bit more of that listed grape attribute to the cup. If it wasn't as pronounced in those earlier days, at this time I could definitely convince myself that it's there. A little bit more defined of a berry attribute to it. Slight bit of florality to complement the savory aspect. Citric components, very much still the most dominant characteristic to the cup. Could even say at times it was a little grassy, and that could have been because I continued to push this cup to get as much acidity and citric acidity as I can from it. So this is the best day of the coffee to this point. I'm just going to continue to roll with it. As on day 32, ramped up the temperatures even higher, so went from the standard 205 to the 208, and then at the end I'm like, let's just go 210 and see what happens, and continues to bring out that citric acidity. You get a little bit more depth to the cup again, slight bit of savory component to it, not my favorite. Tart berry, not my favorite, but at the end of the day there was this very slight peachy aspect that was probably my favorite aspect in this coffee. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we were getting. And we have 2 level 5s, and I don't think they will surprise anybody, so let's discuss those real quick. The acidity at a level 5. Yes, and I think that's the thing I want to discuss the most about Doc's coffees is that's the theme I continue to get. That's what's been consistent about their coffees is almost everything I try has a very strong and bright acidity to it. And I think most notably about that Cassis and the Battle of the Tomato, because that coffee was one of the most acidic cups of coffee I have ever had. And it was so bright and so savory that it really did kind of dominate the flavor profile of that coffee. Citrus, level 5. What's interesting about this coffee is you have a little bit more depth to it at the warmer temperatures, but then it does kind of skew into one direction, which is that strong citrus as it does cool down. I would expect maybe a little bit more of the other attributes to open up, but no, it just really does go in that one direction. A bunch of level 4s, the cleanliness level 4, it's still a clean cup of coffee, even if it is really strong on the acidity, so I don't think that there's much to change about that. The finish, with all of this distinct citrus lemon to the cup, it doesn't necessarily have the most lasting finish. So at the warmer temperatures, you could say it even has a little bit of a shortened finish, that level 3 mark, but definitely in the more moderate, lower temperatures, it has this very bright citric finish, which you could say as a higher side of the level 4. So that's interesting. Sweetness, it is on the lower side of the level 4. It just really skews more in the citric kind of bitter direction. As you can see, that bitterness is at the level 3. However, it still does have a lot of flavor to it, and I feel like there's enough sweetness to justify that level 4 mark, but definitely on the lower side of it. Bunch of level 3s, florality, level 3. It's hard when I'm drinking this coffee now, after it's cooled down so much, to envision the florality, but there was florality at those warmer temperatures. Just like there was the berry component at those warmer temperatures, and there was a slight bit of that stone fruit at those warmer temperatures. But as I took that last sip, it is really just kind of all citric acidity to it in a more bitter sense. Even the savoriness that's there at that level 3 mark, it's not present as I'm drinking it now, but it was at those slightly warmer temperatures. So that would make for an interesting tasting wheel, because this is the way that the coffee tastes, I would say, a little bit after brew, the way I think the coffee was supposed to taste. But if I really changed it to what I'm tasting now after it's reached room temperature, then you're putting all of these at a significantly lower mark. So the florality probably doesn't justify that level 3. The berry fruit doesn't justify it there. Even the savoriness probably just doesn't justify that level 3 mark. But I think this is kind of the direction that the coffee's supposed to be. So I like the way that the tasting wheel looks for those reasons. I think it's pretty accurate of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. Weirdly, for the way I've discussed this one, I feel like it's one of the Doc coffees I've liked a little bit more than most. And it's probably because I just decided to continue rolling with what this coffee was intended to be. And it was intended to be very bright, and it was very bright, and it's not necessarily the most standard Ethiopia, which can be a little bit more fruity and floral, maybe in a more stone fruit direction, maybe even in a more berry direction, as this one just really leaned heavily into the citric direction. And I've always found it interesting, some of the names that they give their coffees. Like this one right here is Grape Lush, but it definitely is a lot more citric than it is berry grape like for this coffee. So I don't know. It was fine. It's not necessarily going to be my favorite Ethiopia, but I thought it was very interesting for Doc's coffees, and it goes along with the theme, like with the Cassis, which was also a very bright, interesting coffee. They're interesting coffees because of just how strong that acidity is. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, and that makes for a very easy recommendation. If you really love your acidic coffees, I feel like those are the type of people that really like Doc's coffees. And people in the past that have really liked Say's coffees when they come out, really acidic, really bright, and they really love to push those really high temperatures to get as much of that acidity out as possible. I was never a big fan of that part of Say's coffees, and I really looked for other things to kind of enjoy about Say's coffees, and that's kind of the same way I am about Doc's coffees. I just find that it's a little bit more tricky to get that from them than it was from Say. So I wouldn't say that they're difficult to brew. I would just say that they have a very kind of specific profile that they're going for, and it's different from a lot of other places. For the most part, I think I'll kind of leave this review at that, as I'm sure I'll discuss them a little bit more in the future. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee or anything from Doc, honestly, would love to know your thoughts and impressions of it or them as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Grape Lush wash processed Ethiopia from Doc Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.